Welcome to everyone who is joining us now. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our first panel for the third annual Forum for Open Research. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you all here today. We'll start in a couple of seconds. We're just waiting for everyone to filter in. While we're waiting, please do take this opportunity to enter. Oh, yeah, sorry, Bianca's got a double up there. Please do take this opportunity, thank you, to welcome everyone and enter your names and introduce yourselves in the chat box. We love to know who you are. We like to encourage you all to talk to each other. We also like to know which countries everyone is from. It's really nice for us to see all of you here, especially because for some of you it's quite late and some of you it's terribly early. So overall, we're honoured that you've joined us this morning. We will start properly in a minute once people have finished joining and filtering in. In the interim, you will see this is a webinar format. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. Your cameras will be off, your microphones will be off, but there will be an opportunity to have a Q&A at the end. So we're very excited and we really want to hear your questions. Key part of this whole event is about vigorous discussion and debate. So please don't hold back, share your thoughts, share your views, and we'll try and have a long and really thought-provoking and engaged discussion and Q&A at the end. So I think we've got enough people in now, and I know you don't really want to listen to me, you want to hear our fabulous panelists. So Alona, if you could skip to the next slide, we will run through the housekeeping. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Zoom now after many post-COVID years. We all know what we're doing, but we like to have a quick recap just in case. You can move the windows around if you're doing other things and having people in the background. Obviously, we hope you'll keep us front and center on the computer and look at all the fascinating slides and presentations. If there are any technical issues or we're talking too fast, do raise your hand. And as I said, do use the chat, so the single speech bubble, for technical issues and to meet and greet. And if you want to thank our speakers or add any interesting side comments to what they're saying, use the chat for that. We will be having a Q&A session after all three speakers have presented, but that doesn't mean you can't track the questions now and add them into the Q&A. We do want to, as I said, have a long and sort of engaged and insightful Q&A at the end. So if you pop up a question, whether it's big or small, please add it into the Q&A. If we don't get to answer all the Q&A questions during the session, because we're going to try and craft a structured Q&A that engages with all the panels, all the papers from the panels, don't worry, we'll keep track of the Q&A and try and ensure that you do get answered after the event has finished. For those of you who are unclear, you will get a certificate for this overall event, but we won't be processing the certificates of attendance until after Thursday is finished. We have over 1,500 delegates now, so I'm sure you can understand it's going to take us a little time to process all the certificates and attendees, so do be patient with us. If you have logged on, with regard to certificates, we will be using the name that you have logged on with here and sending it to the email address you have used here. So if there are any disparities, please do pop my colleagues an email and we'll try and address that. I think that's everything. Oh, one last thing. We hope you will tweet, post on LinkedIn, use Blue Sky, Instagram, whatever you want to spread the word about this event. So please do use the hashtag Forum for Open. It's down in the bottom corner here, so we can keep track of things and repost, but also respond if you have any questions. In addition, there is the QR codes here for the English program and the Arabic program. These are the full brochures, so they've got all the adverts and other events coming up and general information, including the bios of our speakers and various other things. So please do take the time to download the version in your preferred language, as I'm sure that there's a lot of interesting material in there beyond the basic program, which is available on our website. So that is my spiel done. Oh yes, and a final very, very huge and heartwarming thank you to our sponsors. We couldn't do this without our sponsors. We couldn't do this without our partner, the Qatar National Library. And yes, I will stop talking now to a certain extent, and I'm going to start to introduce our panelists. So this is, as I was saying at the very start, just before we began, this is a really exciting panel. It's one that I've been looking forward to an awful lot over the last few months since we got these submissions from today's panelists, Bianca, Jerry, and Danny, and I hope you will find it as interesting as I will. I will be handing over to Bianca in a second to introduce her. well, for her to introduce herself, I guess, but just to give her a bit of a background, after 15 years as a scholarly communications librarian at Utrecht University, she transitioned to an independent consulting role at Sesame Open Science in 2022, and her work really focuses on open science, metadata, and infrastructure. Bianca has researched innovations in scholarly communication, organized workshops on open science, and co-develops courses on scientometrics. I always have trouble with that word. She has also co-authored reports on topics like Plan S, Diamond Open Access, and metadata quality. And crucially for today, she is a founding member of the initiative Open Abstracts, I4OA, and is part of various advisory boards. And she's also been hugely influential, and I think fair to say, the leader in the recent Barcelona Declaration for Open Science. So it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to introduce her here now and to have her have the first presentation for this year's annual forum. So Bianca, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thanks very much for having me here. I'm honored to be the first presentation, and also quite honored to be here together with Jerry and Danny, because together I think this will be a great panel to advocate for open infrastructure. I will share so can you all see my screen? My presentation on screen? That's great. So I will be talking today, kicking off today by talking about the Barcelona Declaration on Open Research Information, which has a very clear relationship with open infrastructure, as I will explain. So first of all, we should address what we mean by open research information and why it is important. Open research with research information, we don't mean research data. We don't mean the publications themselves. Openness for those, of course, also very important. And there's many developments and discussions around open access, around open data that are all very important. The Barcelona Declaration seeks to complement that by talking about research information as metadata. So bibliographic metadata, authors, affiliations, venues where things are published, but also information about funding and information about the use and impact of research. So it's actually information about research actors and research outputs. So why is that important? That's information that's used in decision-making by universities, by funders, by governments, decision-making around strategic priorities, distribution of resources, money, and evaluation of researchers and institutions. That's why information about publications, use of publications is all used. It's also used to assess the effects of policies. For instance, to assess the effect of open access policies, information is used about the number of open access publications, where those are published, under what models. That's all also research information. And then finally, it's used by researchers and other societal stakeholders to find and assess research. When you use bibliographic databases, you are using research information. And why do we feel that it's important that the research information is also open, in addition to the publications being open, in addition to the data being open if they can be? That's because when we're assessing researchers and institutions, it's often based on non-transparent evidence. When you use closed databases, for instance, like Web of Science and Scopus, it's not clear for others who don't have access to those databases what the actual evidence is that you base those decisions on. So we argue that fair assessments requires full transparency. In addition, when using many closed databases, they're often biased against less privileged languages, certain geographical regions outside of the global north, of North America, Western Europe, and Australia, New Zealand, and also biased against certain research agendas. When a database is focused, for instance, more on the hard sciences and leaves out a lot of humanities outputs, then it's biased. And we consider that equitable decision-making requires inclusive data. And then finally, when we talk about open science, as you will be during this conference, when we are monitoring and incentivizing open science using closed data, that's a contradiction. And we feel that open science requires open research information. So that's all reasons why we think it's important to move from using closed research information to open research information. We're not alone in that. The Barcelona Declaration closely aligns with, for instance, what's being said in the UNESCO recommendations on open science, that the monitoring of open science should be kept under public oversight and supported by open, non-proprietary and transparent infrastructures. And also the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, COARA, that aims to reform the way research is evaluated and assessed, also stresses the importance of the independence and transparency of both the data and the infrastructure needed for research assessments. So that's why the Barcelona Declaration comes in. I put a website online where you can also find all the information. It was started actually almost a year ago, in 2 weeks, in Barcelona, as you might have guessed, by when we organized a workshop of about 25 research information experts representing research performing research organizations, research funding organizations, and open infrastructures. And we drafted the declaration there in Barcelona. The preparation of the declaration is coordinated by not just by myself, but also by Kramer from Curtin University in Perth, and Luda Waldman from the Center of Science and Technology Studies, CWTS, in Leiden. And the declaration was published in April 2024. I'll say a little bit more about the current organizations who are signatories and supporters of the declaration, but I first want to go into the actual what's in the declaration. If we think that open research information is important, what do we think are the steps that can help make that transition? And I should say that the declaration is primarily aimed at organizations that carry out, fund, and evaluate research. So research performing organizations, universities, other research institutes, research funding organizations, and organizations doing research evaluation. And we call upon those organizations with 4 commitments. The first commitment is to make openness the default for the research information we both use and produce. So that's about the databases that we use, but that's also about the responsibility we take that our own research information is openly available. And as some examples, Sorbonne University in France recently unsubscribed from the Web of Science, and then crucially, we invested part of that money into open alternatives like OpenAlex. And also the Leiden ranking introduced last year and updated a couple of weeks ago, an open edition of the Leiden ranking, where they also moved away from Web of Science in favor of OpenAlex. Now, I should say that this is not just about Web of Science, it's not just about OpenAlex, it's really about moving away from closed sources of research information, closed bibliographic databases, to open variants. Another example is the French Open Science Monitor, where for monitoring open science, they use exclusively open data sources, and they also make their whole methodology and their scripts openly available. The second commitment is about working with services and systems that support and enable open research information. That may sound like a no-brainer, because if we want to use those systems, we should also work with them. This also includes, though, other types of collaborations. This is a picture of affiliation metadata in Crossref. So this is about publishers providing open information about affiliations of authors in their publications. And you can see on the horizontal line the percentage of journal articles with affiliations that actually have that information, and on the vertical axis the number of publications in the past 3 years. And very obviously there are some publishers who are doing pretty well in that regard, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, and there are some publishers, perhaps not unsurprisingly, Elsevier, Springer Nature, which are absolutely not doing well in that regard. So you could argue many publishers still fail to make affiliation metadata openly available. And that means if you want to use Crossref to find all publications of your university, you cannot. You have to use other databases, often closed databases. And arguably, open access publications are not really open if the metadata are closed. So we're calling upon organizations in their negotiations with publishers to also require that the publishers make this metadata openly available. The third commitment is really crucial to the session we are in today, and that's about supporting the sustainability of infrastructures for open research information. Because it's great that in recent years, a number of infrastructures really developed and really are now a credible alternative to the more closed databases. I mentioned OpenAlex. I'm also going to mention Open Citations, OpenAir, and a lot of other supporting infrastructures like DOAJ, like ROR for the affiliation information. But these infrastructures, they can only exist if they are actually supported, financially supported by participation in governance, and supported by actual usage. So that's what this third recommendation is about. And there are a number of initiatives around that that support that. On the left hand, the principles of open scholarly infrastructures that try to set out some expectations or requirements of open scholarly infrastructures that organizations can also use in deciding what infrastructures to support. On the right-hand side, SCOS, which is organizing that financial support and trying to take work out of the hands of individual organizations and trying to do that more collectively. And I should say that in SCOS, the governing board of SCOS includes library consortia and libraries from all continents, including Qatar National Library. So specifically happy to be here today, at an event organized by Qatar National Library. Also, we will hear later in the session from Invest in Open Infrastructure, which is also doing a lot to bring to the attention the importance of open infrastructures and mapping that landscape. You will hear more from Jerry about that in a second. The fourth commitment in the declaration is, if we want all these things, and if we ask organizations to work towards all these things, this is something that organizations have limited power often to do on their own, and there are many questions surrounding that, like moving away from Web of Science and Scopus. What does that mean for discussions within the organization? Are the alternatives good enough? What are other organizations doing? So we think there's really benefit in working together on this and creating also a bit of the mass needed to accelerate that transition. So that's why the fourth commitment is really about collective action. And that brings me to who are the current signatories of the declaration? Who are the organizations that have already committed to this and are interested in working together on this? This slide shows just a selection of people from various organizations, universities, other more umbrella organizations with their specific motivations for joining the Barcelona Declaration. You can see this on the website as well. In terms of numbers, we currently have 87, a little bit more, and pretty close to 90, I think, currently, organizations in 24 countries who have signed the declaration. So this is universities and other research institutions, research funders, and governments. And I should say, and I should acknowledge that if you look at where these organizations are located, we currently do have a bias, a strong bias still for Europe. We are very happy to have also universities and organizations in Latin America being very involved, also due to their own developments in open infrastructures there. We are also happy to have universities in Morocco and Turkey represented, but we are looking to expand it, and we're really interested to also discuss this, for instance, in this forum today, to have these conversations with institutions in other parts of the world to try and be able to make this initiative more global, because it's really important to also include those voices and not just decide something and organize actions that are beneficial to only universities in Western Europe, North America, but it needs to be relevant for across all regions. As Emily already mentioned, There are also organizations providing data, services, and infrastructure. Those organizations that are really important to enable the actual use and production of open research information. So those organizations can be formal supporters of the declaration, and we're very happy to have Knowledge E as actually one of the first of those organizations from the Middle East. There are also many organizations that have not yet signed, but have expressed an interest in contributing, and there can be various reasons why organizations either cannot sign yet or feel they're not in a position to sign yet. We're very open to have those discussions about having more organizations interested in this and willing to contribute to this. Just highlighting here the list of supporting organizations, because there are many open infrastructures here that will be very relevant to the discussions in this panel. And then I should also mention that the declaration text is in English, but we have been having offers for translation, which is of course very useful to have more engagement. So you can see our current translations. We don't have an Arabic translation yet, and we would be very interested to have one. So if anyone is interested to working to provide translation of the declaration, we'd be very happy to talk about it. Finally, next steps. We just had a conference in Paris a month ago, where we had 130 participants, both on-site and online, like today, where we talked about, we shared information and experiences. So really made use of the different experiences from organizations to have that discussion. What are other organizations doing? What barriers do they face? How are they overcoming those barriers? And many of those talks are available currently on Zenodo. And we also worked at developing an initial roadmap of next steps for coordination and collaboration. And that will be shared more quite soon, but we are envisioning collective actions around journal article metadata, but also metadata of institutional repositories, preprints, data repositories, funding metadata. We are envisioning collective work on replacing those closed systems, helping organizations help each other in moving away from Web of Science and Scopus, work to sustainability of infrastructures, also evaluating open data sources, what's currently out there, to what extent, look at the quality and the coverage of open data sources, and collect evidence of benefits to help discussions within universities. So more on that to come, hopefully pretty soon. Finally, I have some concluding questions for this audience that we maybe can come back to in the discussion, or just more rhetorical questions. Whether your organization is actually ready to sign the Barcelona Declaration, and if you feel you're not, but you would like to, what are things holding back? What are the internal discussions that are relevant for this? How can forum organizations work together to promote the openness of research information? And then finally, also, are you interested in providing an Arabic translation for the declaration? Because that would be very welcome. So we can discuss this more at the end of this session. And you can also always reach out to us by email or to social media. And with that, I'd like to close this presentation and hand back over to Emily.
Thank you, Bianca. That was absolutely brilliant. Danny and I like quietly clapping on behalf of everyone. That was fantastic, and I think it was the perfect opening. And I'm so glad that I scheduled you to be the first one. The perfect opening to this panel, but also perfect opening to what we really want to achieve at this year's conference around transforming knowledge into action, really moving beyond. Wouldn't it be great if we did this, or someone had a plan for this, not just having the plan, but then taking that practical next step and saying, let's implement, let's come up with actual tangible actions and goals and milestones and you know, get into gear on a global scale. So that was brilliant. And on that note, I just sent you a quick email. We have a translator who does translation into Arabic for all our open science partners, so we can pick up on that.
Wonderful. Yes.
Maybe next week. When the event's over and I've had time to breathe.
I actually have to step out now, actually, to talk about those exact actions for the Barcelona Declaration, but I will be back here for the session.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll see you back for the Q&A. And for anyone who's thinking Bianca's disappearing and you won't get a chance to ask her questions, she is unfortunately double booked because she is very busy and important, but she will be back for the Q&A. So please do make sure that you store up your questions and add them in the Q&A, because she will be back to answer them. So now on to our next paper, which is Jerry Salanga, who is representing the sort of infrastructure funding groups, and he's talking about Infra, a new tool to enhance transparency, discoverability, and trust in open infrastructure. Now, Jerry, it currently works on the infrastructure. I can never remember the full title, so I'll just use the acronym, which I invest in open infrastructure. There we go. And he works on their team as engagement coordinator for networks, where he is responsible for community engagement and ensuring that the organization is responsive to the needs of communities that they serve, especially in Africa and Latin America. Jerry holds a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Kenyatta University and is currently undertaking a master's degree in development communication, which I'm sure is hugely useful for him in his current role. And prior to joining the organization, he held senior roles in communication marketing in wildlife conservation, agriculture, and social impact sectors. And obviously, the latter is a huge focus for all of us today. So, Jerry, I will now hand over to you for your panel paper.
Thank you so much, Emily. Let me just share my screen shortly and be ready to get the party started. So thank you very much, Emily. Thank you also to Bianca for that wonderful presentation and setting the stage for this particular conversation. Invest in Open Infrastructure is happy to be a signatory to the Barcelona Declaration, and I can now kick on with my slides. So let me just give a brief overview of Invest in Open Infrastructure. We are an organization that is dedicated to increasing the investment and adoption of open infrastructure across the planet. And one of the reasons why we do this is particularly over time, we noticed that there was a lot of kind of increased importance of open infrastructure in terms of its usability, particularly in research, in academia. But one of the things that was interesting is that the amount of funding that was actually going into developing these open infrastructures, maintaining these open infrastructures was disproportionate. And so IOI was formed with an express desire to kind of, how can we be able to remedy this particular situation with other value-aligned actors? So how do we work as an organization? We always try to ensure that we take an evidence-based approach, a research-driven approach. And here is where we have like our research pilots to different issues that are affecting scholarship across the planet. We also look to provide resources and tools, particularly for scholarship. So when you talk about InfraFinder, this is one of the tools that we have in our data room section. And also there, we also have another tool built off of InfraFinder called the State of Open Infrastructure Report. And also when you talk piloting solutions and coordinating stakeholders, this is where also we have some of our funding mechanisms that actually directly reinvest financially back into the open infrastructures. So we had our Open Infrastructure Fund, which we launched earlier this year, that actually was looking at low and middle income economies, where we contributed some money to infrastructures in those particular jurisdictions. And then also we are launching our IOI Fund for Network Adoption next year. That is more or less looking at providing funding for larger networks at a continental level for a period of at least 3 to 5 years. So what does this look like in practice? I've already mentioned kind of how we do this in terms of catalyzing investment. Strategic support is important because one of the things that we've realized when you're talking to infrastructures, you would often assume that the financial component is actually the biggest challenge that they have, but actually things like governance, community participation, and embedding those kind of systems and processes is really important. And so we have a dedicated arm that does that. And then finally, we have our data room that looks at just providing some of these tools to make sure that you actually have frameworks that can actually be able to allow you to utilize the tools effectively. So IOI is on a mission to increase investment and adoption of open infrastructure. And severally, I've referenced open infrastructure in this particular presentation. I think it's only fair that I give a definition as to what necessarily do we mean when we talk about open infrastructure. So for us, open infrastructure is a service, a protocol, a standard or software that the academic ecosystem needs in order to perform its functions through the research life cycle. So here we're talking from the production of research information, the data collection, the data analysis, the publication, the authoring, the assessment, all of those different stages in the research life cycle. And also there's a number of different criteria that we have when you're talking about open infrastructure. So one, when you talk about infrastructure in the IOI context, we look at tools that meet the definition of open source software. We look at infrastructures that primarily or exclusively distribute openly licensed content. It's open access. We also look at infrastructures that are free to use for anyone. And also the element of community governance is really important, so that these tools have an element of broader community participation and they cannot be co-opted against the values of openness. And then finally, we also look at tools that are operated by a non-profit or a non-commercial entity. So when it comes to open infrastructure can advance open values, is customizable, and can be adapted as needs grow. However, the adoption of open infrastructure is trailing the competitors. And the reason why we put this particular slide here is I'm sure that a lot of us in this particular forum know that of late there's been a lot of consolidation of open tools by other kind of proprietary entities, and that potentially forms kind of like some challenges to accessing knowledge and goes against the principles of openness, which IOI stands for. So when you talk about open infrastructures and when someone is looking at adopting an infrastructure, one of the things that sometimes from our numerous consultations and engagements with stakeholders on multiple continents is that finding the right infrastructure for a particular context can be a hard and slow process. We discovered information related to pragmatism matters most overall, and this includes anything related to costs. So for example, if I want to adopt a new infrastructure, how much will this cost me in terms of the money and also in terms of like the capacity that I need to install, maintain, and upgrade the infrastructure. One of the things that also we have found to be really important information that people are looking for when considering the adoption of an infrastructure is how do I de-risk my purchase? Because also you're looking at, for example, things to do with maintenance of a particular software, for example, or a particular infrastructure. How do I ensure that I have a community of practice that we can actually be able to share information at critical junctures? And also we are looking at issues also to do with dependencies and interoperability. I think this is really important, particularly when you're looking at this in the context of the fair data principles. And also it's important for people who are looking to adopt open infrastructure to really understand what else does this particular infrastructure that I'm considering need to run. And is it also interoperable with other systems that I already have in existence within my particular context. Another thing that is important here is, can this particular infrastructure further the aim of openness, which also includes equitable access? So here the problem that we are trying to particularly solve with infrastructure is particularly when people are looking to kind of find this data of supporting their decision process, is that we found that there's a lot of scattered information across various parts of infrastructure, websites, and forums. So for example, if you're looking at issues to do with, let's say, price and the policy component, the governance systems that a particular infrastructure has, you often did not find this information in one consolidated place. And that's one of the reasons that we were trying to solve this particular challenge through InfraFinder. The other one is that there are different requirements and needs for different institutions and stakeholders. I think this is very important because when you're looking at it from an institutional perspective, what the tech stack that a particular institution may be working from might be completely different to what another institution with different resourcing might require. You also maybe, for example, have in different continents or in different jurisdictions might also have different needs and priorities. And when you look at the totality of all of these different things that I'm talking about in terms of the scattered information, the different requirements, this whole information of processing this information and analyzing that can be very, very time consuming, hence the solution of InfraFinder. So finally, we've now gotten to the InfraFinder platform itself. Here, it's a tool that we actually launched earlier this year, and more or less it's aimed at helping people to navigate the complex landscape of infrastructure services and standards to enable open research and scholarship. So on InfraFinder, you will find up-to-date verified information for a number of different infrastructures across different kind of topical areas. We are first looking at research and data infrastructures, but in our new launch, we actually have now added some new topics, particularly new thematic areas, particularly when you're looking at archival infrastructures, digital preservation infrastructures. We are also looking at having key information in one centralized location. So at the moment, we have, I think, over 120 different infrastructures on InfraFinder, and you can look at these infrastructures across different kind of components. So for example, when you talk about the governance side of these tools, when you talk about the tech stack that they use, when you talk about the funding requirements that actually these infrastructures have, what do you as a potential adopter of these infrastructures require to implement? All of that is centralized in one place. And also an important feature in infrastructure is you actually can be able to compare up to 4 different infrastructures. And this is very helpful, particularly when you're looking at making a particular decision, or maybe when you're looking at making the case to other people within the institution or context that you're working on. So I just put a QR code here of InfraFinder. If anybody would want to maybe make a visit to that particular platform, you can actually be able to just scan this QR code, have a look at the different infrastructures that are there. You can be able to explore the comparisons and all of the features that are there. So when it comes to InfraFinder, there was a very long process of actually kind of designing the whole platform and actually like getting to the final state that we have today. We held over 40 different user research sessions where we kind of were looking at how do we define the utility, data, value, and user experience, just to make sure that it actually resonates and it actually is solving a particular need that is there within the community. And also one of the things that I would want to make sure that is very clear is that infrastructure is inspired and built upon existing resources. So for example, here when you talk about SCOMCAT, which was a precursor to InfraFinder, we also look at the principles of open scholarly information, Helios, R3 data, and more. And so we are learning also from other peers within the space. And also even as we launch the particular platform, we are also learning in terms of the feedback that we get from our communities. And that also is used in an iterative way to make sure that InfraFinder is able to evolve with the needs of the community. So far since we launched, we have had around 8,000 different visits across the world. There's a map here that shows areas where InfraFinder is being utilized. We have had 20,000 plus page views from 90 different countries. And also like some of our most viewed pages have around like 600, I think this should be closer to 700 different views at the moment. So here is kind of a snapshot of InfraFinder, what I was talking about in terms of you have a filter section on the left, and these are the tools. So for example, if you would want to maybe select a particular infrastructure, you can be able to do that. If you'd want to compare, you can do that. And also we have, I highlighted here the location filter. So for example, you can be able to filter the infrastructures according to location, which is quite a nifty feature that we have also integrated InfraFinder. So when you talk about the InfraFinder data, one of the things that we actually utilized the data in InfraFinder, because for each of the over 100 infrastructures, there's a lot of data that we analyzed in collaboration with the representatives from these infrastructure service providers. And we took that kind of process of analysis one step further, and we created what we call the 2024 State of Open Infrastructure report that was kind of looking at different thematic areas when you talk about characteristics of open infrastructures, regional policy dynamics, grant funding data over time. And so one of the things that we have is the report is also available. I'll share a link on the chat. And maybe for this particular section, I'll just focus on the characteristics of selected open infrastructures. And for example, here, out of at that time, we had 57 infrastructures. We were able to kind of do a meta-analysis. So for example, on the policy level, we're able to look at how many of these infrastructures have, for example, policies to do with transparent pricing, privacy, DEI, code of conduct, and all of that is represented here. We also were able to do an analysis of the technical components of these infrastructures. So for example, how many of these infrastructures have an open API, which is important information when you're kind of trying to understand further the level of openness when you look at open code repositories, open product roadmaps, and technical documentation. So all of that information is there. And also one of the important things that we are utilizing the data for is to also have a deep understanding of where is actually the money that is invested in open infrastructure going. So for example, in this particular chart, you actually can be able to see that, for example, out of the money that goes into these open infrastructures, nearly half of the money goes into operations. And actually that, for example, informs additional kind of decision-making that potentially would be interesting, because one of the things that we discovered through the State of Open Infrastructure report is that while there's a lot of emphasis that we need to actually be building new tools from a funder side, there's always that need for innovation. From the infrastructures themselves, the biggest need of financing is actually for operations. So here, when you're talking about things like maintenance, the overheads in terms of like the people who are actually working on that open infrastructure, and kind of having this breakdown of information coming from the infrastructures themselves is a very, very critical information tool for decision making going forward. So what's next for InfraFinder? We would want to particularly look at enhancing the number of infrastructures, open infrastructures that we have on the tool, particularly from the Middle Eastern region. I think this would be very, very valuable to kind of showcase the infrastructures from the MENA region that potentially could find visibility to a much bigger audience, and also to enhance uptake and usability by being listed in InfraFinder. InfraFinder, by the way, is a completely free tool, and we just look at this tool as kind of as a way of sharing more information and making the process of making decisions about adoption of open easier. So if you would want to be listed on InfraFinder, please scan this QR code. It will take you to our expression of interest form, and we'll reach out to you. Then also we are launching the phase 2 of InfraFinder on November 15th next month, where we're launching some additional new features. For example, where we now have, you can actually be able to do a filter according to, let's say, the standards that are there. We are looking at kind of doubling the number of infrastructures that are there. You can also be able to now do the filtration by, let's say, the location, and also look at, for example, what policies were considered in terms of developing a particular infrastructure. Then, as I mentioned, we used the data that we had gathered from the infrastructures in the state of InfraFinder to develop the state of open infrastructure. There's going to be a new edition of this particular report where we're going to be kind of looking at how has the data evolved when you're looking at the grant funding, characteristics, and other topics related to open infrastructure. And also one of the things that we are looking at is also we need feedback in order to make sure that the tool continues to be really relevant and responsive to the needs of the community. So here, if you visit infrastructure, you will happen to see this particular blue widget, want InfraFinder to even be better for you. Kindly click on that particular button. We really want to get your feedback so that we can be able to make the tool better in future versions. So this is just a beginning. Let's continue the conversation. What would you want to see in InfraFinder? How can we be able to make InfraFinder better? If you would want to add your infrastructure to InfraFinder, please fill out the expression of interest form. And then also, please spread the word about InfraFinder. We want to have as many tools as possible because currently we have 120 plus infrastructures, but that is still a relatively small number in the grander scheme of things. And we would want to have more visibility, particularly within the Middle Eastern region, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So thank you very much for that particular time. I'm sure we'll have some questions at the end, but for now, let me pause there and hand back over to Emily.
Thank you, Jerry. That was absolutely fascinating and so interesting. As you know, we've been watching your activities for a while now on the form side, and it's so interesting to see the way you grow and the things that you're thinking about that are things, regardless of whether we're focused on infrastructure or not. So clearly, it's the underlying concepts that we all, any open science advocacy group, or actually, to be honest, anyone in the academic ecosystem, particularly anything supporting scholarly communications and research, we need to be thinking about these things, regardless of whether we're pro-open or commercial. And that leads me very nicely to Danny's talk with the provocatively titled The Commercial Cash Cow Trap, Why We Should Redirect Infrastructure Investment Towards Open. And it's a great pleasure to have Danny here today. Some of you will have heard her speak at our sessions in the past. She is an Australian-based thought leader in international scholarly communications. She's recently moved to become Director of Library Sciences Information at Deakin University, but she's also ambassador for the OAPN Library of Open Access Books. She's consulted for multiple Australian universities since returning from the UK, where she was Deputy Director of Cambridge University Libraries from 2015 to 2019, and her research centres on scholarly communication, including specifically the academic reward structure, scholarly infrastructure, and open access advocacy. She established Open Access Australasia in 2013 and sits on multiple committees, including the Australian Academy of Science National Committee for Data in Science, my apologies, and the Force 11 Board of Directors. So it's a great pleasure to have her here today and to give the final presentation in this panel. So Danny, I will now hand over to you.
Thank you, Emily. I'll just share. Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this topic. And it's one that's quite close to my heart because I've now been working with Deakin University for about 6 months, but the role I held prior to that was working with OAPN. And OAPN is the global library of open access books. I'll talk a little bit about OAPN a bit further down the track, but let's get started on what I mean by the commercial cash cow trap. So a very long time ago, when I was an undergraduate student and I did my honours thesis, I was interested in 1995, and that was the year that the World Wide Web became a commercial entity, so people were actually able to look at the internet and more easily than not having to code. I did a research project for my honours thesis that was asking academics what they thought of these newfangled online journals, and they didn't really like them, was the short answer. But the final paragraph of my thesis said that what was going to happen, this was my prediction in 1995, was that the publishers are going to work out some way of gaining revenue from open access or from online journals, and then they will begin to do so in earnest because they have the power and the resources to force a change. And that what I talked about a lot in my thesis was the sort of development of publishing over the 350 years prior to that. And one of my conclusions here was, unfortunately, for a myriad of reasons, this whole issue could become economic. And it turns out that is actually what has happened. So Let's talk about who owns information. And both Bianca and Jerry have kind of started talking about this as well. So hopefully we're just consolidating the same ideas and making it clearer to everybody. What's been happening over the last few years is a really deeply increase in the percentage of articles that are published by a small number of publishers. Now, the reason why I've got this graph takes us from the year 2000 through to 2022, and I've got a big line here in 2012. And the reason why that line is there is because that's the year that there was a report that was published in the UK called the Finch Report, which made the argument that research that was supported by the publicly funded research should be publicly available. And they decided that the way that should happen was the government was going to invest a lot of money into ensuring that research became openly accessible, because the idea was that publishers would flip their journals. They would take them from being a subscription journal with a hybrid component where you could pay to make a few articles open access, and they would flip to becoming fully open access journals. So that all sounded quite good. But what has actually happened in that time is we can see by the time we get to 2022, and that's still 2 years ago, and you can see that the graphs are continuing upwards, we had about 60% of publications are being published by 5 publishers, and around 82% of publications in the world are being published by 20 publishers. So we have a very big consolidation of all of this research output into a very small number of publishing hands. And what we have here is what's called an oligopoly. So we've got a monopoly is when everything's one organisation. An oligopoly is when it's a few, but everything is concentrated into those few. And what we are seeing here is pretty much the same phenomenon. All of these articles, these 3 articles, are making the same case, that we are now in a situation where publishing is really being run by a very small number of organisations. And it's not just publishing. So a lot of these organisations are, some people call it platformisation, and some people call it vertical integration. So there are anti-competitive rules around organisations sort of taking over on a horizontal basis, but there are not at the moment anti-competitive rules about taking over other aspects of a related organisations. So what's happening is that what were academic publishing companies are now becoming data companies. They're running big systems that run data, that run research. And it's the same companies that are publishing this work. So we're getting even further concentration of everything into a very small number of organisations. So this slide is referring to, this is a marketing slide, that reference there is a marketing article, and it's talking about having a brand, and you can have a house of brands or a branded house. And that's with one company can kind of operate this way. And I'll show you 2 different examples. So digital science has a branded house. So these are all different products that digital science has got, and you may be familiar with some of them. You may have used some of them. So you might be use Dimensions to look and analyze your work in your institution. You might have looked at your altmetric score of where your research has ended up in social media, for example. You might use Overleaf to write your work. All of these products are either developed by digital science or bought by digital science and then branded under the digital science banner. So that's a branded house. An example of a house of brands is Elsevier, or Relics, which is now the parent company. This work was done in 2017, so 7 years ago, and what it was looking at was the full research data life cycle and how you can live in an Elsevier environment throughout that research life cycle. So all of these are organisations and companies and products that Elsevier has bought, has retained the original branding from. So it's not necessarily clear that these are Elsevier products. So you can be in an Elsevier environment and not even understand that you are completely beholden to Elsevier. So these are a couple of articles I've written earlier this year, which are really at the end of last year, which is trying to make the argument that we've got to start thinking about all of these issues as being interrelated with one another. That we can't just talk about looking at open access or looking at research integrity or looking at how we manage research information or research data or research culture. All of these things are actually part of one really complicated and very messy mess. And we need to be thinking about all of those things together if we want to try and solve some of the problems we have with credibility in science at the moment, with the overpublication, with poor, questionable research practices, and all of these things that are related to the problem we have in that publishing an article is the one thing that you get rewarded for. And because of that, there's a lot of poor practice that is going on. So we've really got to unpick the whole picture before we can start to really make things better. If we just look at one thing, we're not going to really solve it. So one of the arguments when we think about these solutions is the idea about open scholarly infrastructure. And that's what we're talking about in this panel today. And is this a solution? Now, this was an observation by Jeffrey Bilder, who's a great thinker in this space. He made the observation 9 years ago, and he was saying that everything we have gained by opening content and data. So we've been focused up until that point very much on the output, on the open access, make the article open access. We were starting to talk about make the underpinning data open access. But he's saying everything we've gained by doing this is under threat if we allow the enclosure of scholarly infrastructures. And so this was the proposal, the original proposal of a set of principles for open infrastructure to support the research community. And so that's how we ended up with the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. So that's where that started, which we've already referred to today. And these are a set of principles that talk about governance and sustainability and insurance. If you've got open scholarly infrastructure, these are the kinds of things you need to think about to make sure your infrastructure will continue on. And having the support of things like Invest in Open Infrastructure is part of that. So then we come to this question about what is open infrastructure. And so Jerry earlier spoke about how Invest in Open Infrastructure defines it. There are many, many definitions. This one is from UNESCO, and they refer to shared research infrastructures, and there's lots and lots and lots and lots of words there. It's quite a good definition. We'll go into a couple more in a moment. But here's where we start getting into the question of language. And this is the beginning of a discussion I had online with Mark Hannell from Figshare, and he gave a talk. He put something up into LinkedIn, and he said, last month, the Figshare team presented Times Higher Education, blah, blah, blah. And the title was Leveraging Open Research Infrastructure for Digital, blah, 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 blah. And I thought, I was working for OAPEN, and I said, look, I'm sorry to split hairs, but Figshare is not open research infrastructure. It's commercial infrastructure that supports open research. That opened a very big can of worms. So what he responded was, here are these different definitions of open infrastructure. And he said, but everyone's always entitled to their own opinion. Now, I don't think this is a matter of opinion. I think this is quite important that we actually understand what we're talking about. We need to have shared language. So I sort of said, I think this is very nuanced. And looking at the Invest in Open Infrastructure definition, I talked about some of the things that Jerry talked about then. So I was saying, is there a different term that infrastructure supporting open research that's open and not commercially owned? Is there a different word we can use for that? And so Mark said, I don't think there is. Here are some suggestions. And then overnight, because I'm in a different time zone, I woke up in the morning and I thought, the difference we've got is we've got open research infrastructure or open research infrastructure. So there's a slight difference there. And I can understand that if English is not your first language, this is probably quite confusing, because it's confusing for people for whom English is their first language. So then I looked at the definitions that Mark had referenced. So CERN's definition says it refers to the set of technological tools and services that support and enable open science practice. Now, under that definition, commercial commercial infrastructure that supports open research does fit under this definition. I'm not sure that CERN intended that. If you look at the kinds of infrastructures they support and develop and are referring to on that page, they are all open infrastructure and non-commercial. But I think it's just slightly loose wording there, which is unfortunate. When we get to the Scoping the Open Science Infrastructure Landscape in Europe report from Spark, they talked by infrastructure, we mean the structures and services needed for open scholarship to operate. Again, it's a bit loose in terms of it could be misinterpreted. The tighter definition comes in when we look at the UNESCO document. So right at the bottom of all of those words on the right-hand side, they make the point that the open science infrastructure should be not-for-profit and guarantee permanent and unrestricted access to all public to the largest extent possible. So that's the conversation came up about the problem about language, and in fact, the difficulty we're having currently in the open space about language being co-opted. And things like gold open access now, which originally just meant publishing open access, sometimes you paid an article processing fee, sometimes you didn't. It has been co-opted to mean pay for publishing. And so a new term had to be created called diamond open access, which was free to read, free to publish. And there's now a bit of argy-bargy around even that term. So there's a lot of, the goalposts keep changing in this space. There's a lot of commercial encapsulation of the language that's used in the open space, which we need to be really careful of. And so on the left-hand side was a bit of an exchange that occurred in 2021, where Aaron Tay, who's been involved in this area for a long time, said, "Am I fighting a losing battle to correct people whenever they defined gold open access to mean article processing charges? Should I even bother?" So now 4 years later, or 3 years later, we've lost that battle. We've all moved on. It's really frustrating because we think we know what we're talking about and other people misinterpret it. And that is a deliberate strategy on behalf of commercial organisations, really deliberate strategy. So Jeff Builder, again, he talks about the principles of FOPEN scholarly infrastructure that is pretending to be open, but in fact isn't. So open washing. And so what he's saying is words like non-profit, mission-driven or research-driven, shared infrastructure, common infrastructure, researcher-led or researcher-focused don't necessarily mean that they are open. It's more likely that they are, but you really need to look at the question about, is this infrastructure open? Because even the term non-profit is simply a tax status. It's not a badge of virtue. So we do need to be careful to understand what it is we're talking about when we talk about open. So this Barcelona Declaration, as already discussed today, is a declaration specifically about open infrastructure, not commercial infrastructure that supports open research. And we've got the Invest in Open Infrastructure. So these are the two previous presentations. I don't need to say anything because they've both been explained really beautifully. What we have here now is a wonderful opportunity at this time in our world, and Invest in Open Infrastructure is a great place to start to find some of these different infrastructures where there are now at the kind of scale that we have not had before. We have got a lot of open opportunities where we can choose to go open instead of investing in a commercial entity. So, for example, Open Alex is a valid and robust alternative to Web of Science or Scopus, for example. And one of the issues we have, particularly with Web of Science, but Scopus as well, is if we look at publications that are in non-English speaking languages, they are very poorly represented in those databases, whereas Open Alex is a much, much more comprehensive database of research outputs. So particularly if you're in an organisation or in a country that primarily does not publish in English or would rather not publish in English because it is more appropriate to publish in the language of the country that you're in, then you are going to have yourself much better represented in something like Open Alex than you will in Web of Science or Scopus. And they're not cheap, these databases, I can tell you, because we're having those conversations in my own institution. So I'll just quickly now, to finish off, just talk about OAPEN and the Directory of Open Access Books as an open infrastructure and how it works. So the OAPEN Foundation started as a project originally. So it was given some funds for the sort of proof of concept funds, which was the idea about creating a library of open access books. So it's built in DSpace, which itself is an open access infrastructure, and it hosts, distributes, and preserves over 30,000 peer-reviewed open access books from over 400 publishers. So those books are monographs. They're not textbooks. So there's other places where textbooks are collected, open access textbooks are collected. So that's the OAPEN library. And then a few years after that, the organisation decided to create a directory of open access books. So that includes all of the books in the OAPEN library, but also other open access books that have been published around the world. These slides are as up to date as I think, but that number keeps getting bigger fast. So last time I looked, it's about 74,000 peer-reviewed open access books from around the globe, indexed in the Directory of Open Access Books. And then we have the OAPEN OA Books Toolkit, which has just been renewed and launched for Open Access Week. So it's a service that helps has a whole lot of case studies in it. So if authors or publishers are interested in publishing an open access book, that is a toolkit that can help you with that. So the foundation is not for profit and not for sale. It's transparent, it's open, and it's community driven. So it started with funding that was a project funding, but then had to start becoming self-funded. So how has it done that? Well, for a start, have a look at these numbers. So from 2014, the numbers of books have just gone up exponentially. And what we can see is that we're really starting to increase because the numbers of open access books are starting to increase in the world, which is fantastic. So what OAPEN would like to do, and the Directory of Open Access Books, is partner with trusted partners around the world to increase the number of books in languages other than English. There are many books listed in both that are in languages other than English, but the group would like that to be increased. So if you are a publisher that is publishing open access books in a language other than English, then please do get in touch because OAPEN would be very interested in talking with you. The directory was launched in 2013. Oh, a bit too fast. See, yes, this is a more up-to-date one. It's now up to 86,000 plus. I thought I was looking at the 74,000. I think it's more than that. 86,000 peer-reviewed books. So that's going great guns. And so I brought this slide in here because it's a bit like the Olympics for Australia. We had an enormously disproportionate number of medals in the Olympics for the size of population that Australia has. And this is very similar. That we've got something like a third of the world's population, and yet we are the 6th largest user of the downloads out of the directory in the world, which is extraordinary. So it's not necessarily where you think people are going to be. You can see that India and Russia beat Australia. Sorry, I'm jumping forward. The other thing is there's a lot of products, and some of these are open and most of them are not, that actually are relying on the infrastructure of OAPEN or the Directory of Open Access Books. And I find this quite interesting because these are organisations that do not contribute to the organisations, but they rely on the infrastructure of it, which is another kind of problematic arrangement we have because it's open, they're free to use it. So off they go. But if OAPEN had to close its doors tomorrow, they would have trouble because they haven't contributed to it yet, they're using it. So the Scoping the Open Science Infrastructure Landscape makes the point about this kind of infrastructure is currently operating independently of one another and without collective funding or coordinated long-term community support for sustainability. So this is the problem, is we really need coordination. So the Invest in Open Infrastructure and the SCOES initiatives are really helpful, but we've got a problem in that it's quite confusing from the other side, from the library side, to navigate. So we do have, that's a sort of a example of the number of supporters, library supporters that OAPEN has, but it's still it's a lot of work for the support that we get, and we're so grateful for the support that we do have. But we really sort of need to try and coordinate this across other infrastructure as well. So, for example, if you look at open access books, here are some other organisations that come up. So there's the Open Access Books Network. There's the Open Access Network, which has an open access books component. We've got openbook.com and openbook.network. Now, they all kind of sound the same. They're all completely different organisations. So it's very difficult if you kind of don't have your head in this space to navigate this, because what's the difference between them? I don't understand. They're all asking for, from a library's budget point of view, small amounts of money, large amounts of money for them. But which one do I support? Is it the same? Haven't I already given some money to this? It becomes really problematic. So there is, in terms of just the open book space, there is something now called the Open Book Collective, and that's a place which is trying to pull all of these things together. So the point of what I'm trying to say here is that we've got a lot of really incredible, I've just shown you a couple of examples that I know quite a lot about, but there's a myriad of other amazing open infrastructures out there that need some support. And what we need to do is really try and create a collective way of joining this together to make it easier for those organisations that do want to support this infrastructure to know where to go. So I've already mentioned that invest in open infrastructure and SCOs. So now you've seen these slides a couple of times. Hopefully they're starting to get remembering. So what you need to do, it's not enough just to use infrastructure that supports open research. It's better than not doing open research, but we'd rather you use open infrastructure. Not-for-profit cannot be sold open. So the most important thing is please support open infrastructure. And I think that's the end of my slide. So thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I think we'll all agree that was a really perfect sort of conclusion to the discussions we've had so far today. And it's so interesting, particularly everything you're talking around the oligopolies and that continued sort of balance between open infrastructure and infrastructure for open, which even just saying it's a very awkward phrasing. It'd be great if anyone comes up with a single catch-all term that we can use, for A or B. That would make all our lives a lot easier when we talk about this stuff. So we've now got time for Q&A, and we've got a nice little bit of time, nearly 20 minutes. So I do hope you'll all be thinking and have lots of questions to ask everyone. We seem to have actually just, there we go. I was about to say we've lost Jerry, but Jerry seems to be back now. And Bianca will hopefully join us shortly as soon as her event is done. Bianca, if you can hear me, please do come back and join us. In the meantime, as I said, for all of you here now, our lovely attendees, please do put the questions into the Q&A. That's the double speech bubble. It is marked Q&A, and we'll run through them and ask them as we go. So we have a question for Jerry, very practical question. And I'll just run through all the questions in no particular order. And as I said before, if you feel your question wasn't answered, don't worry, we are tracking them, and where possible and appropriate, we will pass them on to our panelists to see if they have an answer, but also you might be able to find your answer on their respective websites that were circulated in the chat. So, Jerry. We sort of really use that, the tool that you've described, which is obviously a fantastic tool, and I'm sure we'll all agree, to evaluate the community of infrastructure providers, and where is there disproportionate representation, and why do you think that that's occurred within that particular sort of field of investment and activity?
Thank you. I think let me first start with the comment from Bashem about persistent identifiers, particularly in the context of the tools that we are developing. So if you were to look at InfraFinder in itself as a tool, actually, we already have a number of different persistent identifier tools that are listed there. RAW, as you mentioned, is already one of the tools that is there. We have Crossref, we have DataSite. And one of the things that is really important is that InfraFinder, as it is built now, it is more of kind of meant to be like a one-stop shop place for you to kind of get all of your information in a centralized location. one of the things that also we are trying to do, and this is something that we are still in the formative processes of working through, is how do we also make sure that the additional visibility that these infrastructures get also allows them now to also get additional funding from donors or supporters or philanthropies that potentially would also help them to be able to scale up their infrastructure. So that particular funding component is also really important, because for this additional kind of interoperability, particularly when we talk about persistent identifiers, if you were to look at Africa, Latin America, there's still relatively a lot that needs to be done, particularly on PIDs. So that also is something that we really are focused on. In terms of like the other question that you had mentioned, Emily, based on the data that we are seeing in Infra Finder, I think one of the things that is there is when we started the process of developing Infra Finder, we kind of started out with an explicit focus on Europe and North America. And the reason for that was we kind of wanted to kind of have a proof of concept, which is what phase one was, in terms of, okay, this is how the platform works. This is how you can use all of these different functionalities. But also one of the things that we are doing, and actually that's one of the explicit remits of my role, is also to engage particularly in Latin America, Africa, Asia, places that traditionally have gotten less visibility. And also that's why we are explicitly looking at how can we be able to get more infrastructures when you're looking at these particular regions that I've mentioned. Because at the moment in InfraFind, I think we only have maybe 3 or 4 infrastructures from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And I think this is something that is as a result of the fact of when you look at the development of open science in these particular regions, they have tended to kind of be a little bit behind when you talk about Europe and North America. So over time, as we do more sensitization, as people are more aware about this particular platform, there's a lot of really, really good work that's happening in these regions. I think it's only a matter of time. Once you build this work in collaboration with value-aligned partners, then we'll be able to get that additional visibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. It was a delightfully comprehensive answer, and I'm sure that will trigger some more questions shortly. Now a question for Bianca, and thank you so much for jumping out of your meeting and coming back to join us. We really appreciate it. A question from Tatiana Usova here in Qatar is, how do you deal with researchers that need to use articles that are published in closed publications for their research, and how does that sort of fit into the sort of the ethos and drive of your organization?
Well, I think it's a bit of 2 different discussions. As I said in the beginning, the declaration is not about open access publications in themselves or closed access publication. That's a different discussion, a very relevant discussion. And of course, also very much in research assessment, that requirement of publishing, perhaps not necessarily closed articles, but articles in certain journals that are less often open. It's a very important discussion. However, for research information, both metadata of open access articles and closed access articles, they both have metadata, and it's about those metadata that those are open. So it's a bit of a different discussion. Of course, I think having a more comprehensive and a less biased and a more complete coverage of metadata of publications will also help research assessment reform, and will also help make the case and make it easier to assess and to include in assessment all kind of publications and other research outputs. So that might help combat the bias against certain venues for publication. So indirectly, there's a link, but otherwise the whole discussion about publishing open access or closed access and which venues to publish is a discussion that's adjacent, but not central to the Barcelona Declaration.
Thank you. Sorry, apologies. And a question for Danny. Obviously, a lot of what you were saying, and I think those infographics really, really highlight the sort of the scale of integration on the commercial side, you know, the vertical integration, the way that we're never leaving the carefully crafted ecosystem of specific publishing conglomerates. But then on the other side, there is that sort of interconnectivity, that sort of interreliance of all of the small groups. You know, we're all working together, and you know, I'm delighted that OAPN and the Directory of Open Access Books are about to become members of us as well. We're signing tomorrow, day after. So it is, you know, we're all working together for a common goal, and there isn't multiple layers of connectivity and support and everything else. But could you perhaps talk a bit more about that? Because obviously I think that comes to the core of how we can make things work.
I think that the problem, part of the problem, there's a couple. One is very much the assessment system that we have. So the published paper being the jewel in the crown, and so therefore multiple people want to get on authorship lists, and we have paper mills, and we have predatory publishing for the sake of just getting a publication. So there's a whole lot of problems that are associated with assessment being based on article, with a subsequent problem that assessment itself, things like university rankings, are using very limited numbers of, like, they're basically using Web of Science or Scopus. So we have got university rankings which are only looking at a proportion of the research output. And when you start looking at the Leiden rankings, which is using OpenAlex, suddenly that list looks very, very different about university rankings. So we've got a problem about that kind of co-option of the conversation there. So that's one side, is the assessment problem. I think when we get into these broader conversations about publication and so on, we actually have a pretty ill-informed academic cohort. We really need to do something much more organised and strategic and sector-wide about ensuring our academic community knows about all of this, because they don't mostly. And so the interaction they have with all of this is usually they have a relationship with the editor, with a couple of journals. They might not even know which publisher publishes those journals, because they interact at the journal level, not the publisher level. So whether or not they had a supervisor or somebody in their work environment who is across some of this, who's having these conversations with them, is entirely random. So until you've got to that, so we've got in the Netherlands, there's conversations happening across the country, whereas in Australia, it's very much pockets of conversations. It's really hard to have these have discussions about how it's all joined up when most of the people you're trying to talk to aren't even aware of the different components of it. So it's really challenging, and I think it comes down to the way we train researchers. But Bianca, you might want to say something about what's happening in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, just briefly, I think we are lucky in a way that we are a small country and we have a limited number of universities and they collaborate quite closely. So basically, on a practical level, all our negotiations, all our publisher negotiations are done collectively through the library or through the university consortium rather than by individual universities. And that also means that there's a forum for more discussions, as Danny was saying, discussions about the more overarching aspects and principles underlying that. And we're having that very much currently in, okay, do we want to continue with these transformative agreements? What's the role for community, like academic sovereignty and those principles? So those discussions are at least happening. It also lays bare like that there are many different opinions also within universities and libraries on that. But having those discussions, having those out in the open, I think really helps in moving this discussion forward. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we have one more time for a group question, which is sort of, we'll see who wants to dive in first, but I hope you'll all have a weigh in, is we arguably don't have a clear consensus for open data. How much do you feel not having such a consensus definition for open data is causing the types of issues you've all identified for articles and infrastructure? Who wants to jump in first? In which case, Bianca, I'll nominate you because you're not muted right now.
Yeah, I'm a bit in two minds about that. Yes, definitions matter. I think it's more about being clear what we're talking about and when we're talking about research data, when we're talking about research information, when we're talking about publications. That's important. Whether we need one definition, I'm a bit less convinced, because depending on the circumstance, depending on the actor, different aspects of a definition might be more important. We've had that with open science in general. Open science is an umbrella term, and it has many different aspects. And I think it's important to be clear about what specific aspect we're talking about, rather than just to force one encompassing definition on the whole system. But I do think it's important to be very clear about what we're talking about when we have a discussion on any of these aspects.
Yes, I think the clarity of terminology is something that's coming to the fore increasingly in this panel. Jerry, do you have anything to add at this point?
Yeah, I think particularly when you're talking about open scholarly communication, the issue of definitions is always a hot button issue, particularly when you're looking at the definition of open infrastructure, open data, open science. That has been a common challenge across the years. Personally, I think that having a common definition would really help, because particularly when you're looking at developing economies, there's a lot of splitting hairs that comes to definitions. And I feel like having a common overarching kind of baseline of, okay, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about open data, would really help us to kind of achieve that particular progress. Because I've seen that in some of these communities, there's very big differences when it comes to how people perceive a particular concept when it comes to open data, open infrastructure, and that kind of causes some fissures, which when you talk about the overall progress of open science, tends to limit our ability to move forward at a fast pace. So I would be for the idea that an a standardized definition would be of value here.
I completely agree, and I think it's obviously when you bring in different languages as well, it's a problem we very much have in this region, is defining the conceptual underpinnings of the word open itself within the Arab languages is something that we've been working on as an initiative for a while now to make sure that it's actually accurate when delivered in localized resources. So Danny, do you have anything to add to this final question?
We tend not to use the term open data in Australia. We use the expression as open as possible, as closed as necessary. There's a lot of questions around Indigenous knowledge here, for example, where that data is not yours to share. So we talk about fair data, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. And I think that that's less contentious a term. It's not perfect. There are still potential multiple interpretations of that, but I think it, just by the fact that there are 4 words there instead of 1, means that it is less open to multiple interpretations. So we talk about fair data. So that's something of a solution.
Thank you, Danny. And finally, thank you again, all of our speakers. It's now my role to supposedly try and consolidate an incredibly rich and sort of wide-ranging series of papers and discussions into one sentence. I'll have a stab at it. I feel there's probably too many clauses for it to really count as one sentence. But if I was going to try and really cut to the meat of this, I think what we're all saying, and I hope you'll all agree, is that openness should be the default where humanly possible. We need to collaborate in multiple ways with all the stakeholders, actors, and providers to achieve this, and to really focus on ensuring practical, equitable, and sustainable commercial models, funding approaches, and conceptual touch points, by which I'm trying to find a nice way of saying language there and terms. We're not there yet. There's obviously still a little way to go, but I think we're on the right track, and I think we'd all agree on that. And we're starting to really develop that plan for collective actions and community roadmaps across the global scholarly communications ecosystem. Hopefully we'll all agree that that's as consolidated a summary of today as possible. So once again, thank you to the 3 of you. It's been such an honor to listen to these papers and to see what you're all working on, and it's really inspiring. And as I said before, and people have said in the chat already, it's a really great start to what we really want to achieve over the next few days. So thank you so much for joining us. We are hugely appreciative to those of you joining in different hours, and also to everyone who's joined and engaged as delegates in the chat. Just a reminder to our delegates, there is a link in the chat now for a survey. I know you get asked to fill in surveys a lot, and it's obviously a pain, and you're busy and you want to jump into the next panels, but please do take the time to fill in at least one of the surveys over the course of the next few days, because we do use these surveys to determine what the overarching theme for next year's event should be, what kind of focus areas we should use, but also for our monthly community development activities. We want to listen to you. You are our network. You are our stakeholders. We want to deliver the kind of capacity building opportunities that you need and want. And the only way we can identify that is if you tell us. So please do take the time to tell us what you want to hear about and to make any recommendations for other topics for the future. So thank you all for joining us. And once again, thank you so much to Jerry, Bianca, and Danny. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.